In the heart of New York City, where music met crime and hope danced with danger, there lived a man who ruled the streets not with fear, but with respect. His name was whispered in the alleys, sung in the bars, and written in the history of Harlem. That man was Bumpy Johnson, but behind the name was not just a gangster. He was a thinker, a leader, and a man who walked the fine line between good and evil. This is the story of how a boy from the South became the Godfather of Harlem. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. He came from a poor but proud African-American family. His parents worked hard, but life in the South was cruel and unfair for black people at the time. Segregation, racism, and violence surrounded their everyday world. His mother called him Bumpy because of a small bump on the back of his head, a mark that would stay with him forever. When Bumpy was about 10 years old, his older brother, Willie, got into trouble with white police officers. That moment changed everything. Their parents feared for their sons' lives. So, like thousands of other black families during the Great Migration, they packed what little they had and left the South behind. Their destination, Harlem, New York City. When they arrived in Harlem, it was a different world. The streets were alive with music, laughter, and dreams. The Harlem Renaissance was blooming. Poets, jazz musicians, and artists filled the air with creativity and pride. But behind the beauty was a darker truth. There were no real opportunities for young black men. Jobs were scarce, money was tight, and the streets offered quick rewards for those willing to take risks. Bumpy was smart, much smarter than most people realized. He loved to read, especially poetry and philosophy. He could quote Shakespeare and talk about politics with older men at the barbershop. But books couldn't pay the rent, and in Harlem, survival came first. So Bumpy started doing small jobs for hustlers in the neighborhood. He ran errands, carried messages, and learned how the game worked. He watched, he listened, and he never forgot. He noticed how people respected power, not just muscle, but the power of brains. By the age of 16, Bumpy was already known on the streets. He wasn't the biggest or the loudest, but he was the one who always kept his cool. If someone tried to cheat him, he didn't fight with fists. He outsmarted them. That's what made him different. He wasn't just a kid from the block. He was a strategist. But Harlem in the 1920s was a dangerous playground. The Prohibition era had turned the city into a gold mine for gangsters. Liquor was illegal, and everyone wanted a piece of the profit. The Italian Mafia controlled much of the business downtown, while the black community tried to keep control of their own neighborhood. One name ruled Harlem's underground world: Madame Stephanie St. Clair, also known as the Queen of Harlem. Madame St. Clair ran the numbers racket, an illegal gambling system that allowed everyday people to bet small amounts of money on lucky numbers. It was the heartbeat of Harlem, a poor man's dream. But that dream was under attack. The Italian mob, led by Dutch Schultz, wanted to take over Harlem's numbers business. They came with bribes, threats, and violence. But St. Clair wasn't a woman who bowed to fear. And when she needed someone to protect her empire, she turned to the one man who could, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy became her right hand, her enforcer, and her trusted lieutenant. He was loyal to her and to Harlem. He wasn't just fighting for money, he was fighting for respect. To him, Harlem wasn't just a place. It was home. It was family, and he would rather die than let outsiders take it. The war for Harlem's streets began. Gunfire echoed through alleys, bodies dropped. But through it all, Bumpy proved himself. He was fearless, calculated, and always one step ahead. He learned that power wasn't about who fired the first shot. It was about who survived the last one. As the years passed, Bumpy became more than just a gangster. He became a symbol. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a protector. He paid rent for families who couldn't afford it. He helped kids go to school. He gave food to the poor. And when a man disrespected a woman on his block, Bumpy made sure it never happened again. In the eyes of Harlem, he was their Robin Hood, a man who broke the law but kept the peace. Still, deep inside, Bumpy knew the world he was building was fragile. Every choice came with a cost. Every favor created an enemy. But he had already chosen his path, and he would walk it with pride. The boy from Charleston was gone. In his place stood a man the city couldn't ignore. A man whose name meant both danger and dignity. His story was only beginning, because soon, Harlem would belong to Bumpy Johnson. By the early 1930s, Harlem was alive. Music in every doorway, laughter on every street, and danger hiding behind every corner. The Harlem Renaissance had given the world its poets, its thinkers, its sound. But in the shadows, another kind of empire was rising, one built on gambling, hustling, and power. And at the top of that empire sat a woman the city called Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Harlem. Madame St. Clair wasn't just any woman. She was bold, smart, and fearless. In a world run by men, many of them white and ruthless, she built her own fortune and ruled Harlem's numbers, racket like a queen protects her throne. She spoke with authority. She dressed like royalty, and most of all, she refused to bow to anyone. But power attracts enemies. And for Madame St. Clair, the biggest threat was coming from downtown. The Italian Mafia, led by Dutch Schultz, had their eyes on Harlem. They wanted her territory, her money, and her control. Dutch Schultz was known for his brutality, the kind of man who believed fear was the only language people understood. He sent his men into Harlem, bribing police, threatening shop owners, and beating anyone loyal to St. Clair. Harlem was at war, and Madame St. Clair needed someone who could protect her people. Someone sharp enough to think and strong enough to fight. That's when Bumpy Johnson entered her life. Bumpy had already made a name for himself in the neighborhood. He was calm under pressure, smart in the streets, and dangerous when crossed. He wasn't loud. He didn't boast. He simply got things done. When St. Clair first met him, she saw something she hadn't seen in any man before: discipline and intellect. He respected her power, not her gender. He didn't see a woman running a racket. He saw a general commanding an army. Their partnership was built on respect. She taught him business. He taught her strategy. Together they became unstoppable. Soon Bumpy became her right-hand man, her enforcer, protector, and advisor. If someone owed Madame St. Clair money, Bumpy collected it. If someone disrespected her name, Bumpy handled it. And if anyone dared to cross into Harlem's streets without permission, they met Bumpy's quiet, deadly stare. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted or threatened. He didn't need to. When Bumpy showed up, people knew things were serious. The streets began to talk. They said, "The Queen's got a soldier now." And that soldier's name was Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz didn't take it well. He wanted Harlem, and he was willing to spill blood for it. His men raided St. Clair's businesses, robbed her runners, and kidnapped her associates. But Bumpy fought back with precision. Every time Dutch's men moved, Bumpy moved faster. Every strike they made, he countered twice as hard. He didn't just fight with guns, he fought with strategy. He built networks, bribed the right cops, and made sure Harlem stayed protected. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about pride. To Bumpy, Harlem was home. And no outsider was going to take it. The war lasted months. The streets were filled with whispers of ambushes, shootouts, and payback. But slowly the tides began to turn. Dutch Schultz started losing ground. His power downtown began to crack, and soon he was facing heat from all sides, not just from Bumpy, but from the Italian bosses themselves. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. To this day, no one knows who ordered the hit, but Harlem celebrated quietly. For Bumpy and Madame St. Clair, it was a victory that proved their power could stand against anyone, even the Mafia. After Dutch's fall, St. Clair decided to step back. She had fought her war. She had defended Harlem's independence. Now she wanted peace, and she trusted only one man to carry her legacy forward: Bumpy Johnson. She passed her empire into his hands, saying, "Harlem needs a man with a brain and a heart. That's you, Bumpy." From that day forward, Harlem's underworld had a new ruler. And unlike the mobsters downtown, Bumpy wasn't just a criminal. He was a leader, a businessman, and a man who believed that power should be used with purpose. Bumpy's leadership brought order to Harlem's chaos. He stopped random violence, set clear rules for the streets, and kept the peace between gangs. If someone disrespected the neighborhood, they faced consequences. If someone helped the community, they earned protection. People started calling him the mayor of Harlem. Shopkeepers would nod when he passed. Elders would smile. Even the police, and as corrupt as they were, gave him a wide berth. To Harlem's poor, he was a hero. To the Mafia, he was an equal. To his enemies, he was a storm waiting in silence. But even as Harlem prospered under his rule, Bumpy knew the world outside was changing. Prohibition was ending. New hustlers were moving in, and the power he had earned would soon be tested again. Still, Bumpy wasn't afraid. He had survived the South. He had survived the streets. He had faced Dutch Schultz and walked away stronger. Now he stood at the top, the man who had learned from a queen how to rule like a king. His story was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy, and the next chapter would show that every king's crown comes with a price. By the mid-1930s, Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson. He had earned his throne not by luck, but by loyalty, intelligence, and blood. The Queen of Harlem, Madame Stephanie St. Clair, had passed him her empire, and with it came the weight of an entire community, a community that trusted him, feared him, and depended on him. But even kings must fight to keep their crowns. And for Bumpy Johnson, Harlem was never truly safe. The streets were restless. Prohibition had ended, and bootleg liquor was no longer big business. Gambling was still strong, but the Italian mob, men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, had new plans. They wanted Harlem back under their control. They saw Bumpy not as a partner, but as a problem. A black man with too much power, a man who could not be bought or bullied. So they tried another way, business. Luciano invited Bumpy to a meeting downtown. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. Bumpy arrived dressed in a fine gray suit, hat tilted low, calm as always. Around him sat some of the most dangerous men in New York, mob bosses, killers, and silent enforcers. But Bumpy didn't flinch. He walked in like he belonged there. Lucky Luciano spoke first. He said Harlem would be better managed if they all worked together, meaning if Bumpy agreed to share control. Bumpy listened quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He just smiled and said, "Harlem don't belong to no one who wasn't born in it." The room fell silent. Even Luciano had to respect the man's nerve. That day, Bumpy didn't win a war, but he won something far more powerful: respect. Back in Harlem, Bumpy built his empire the way a general builds an army, with loyalty, discipline, and fairness. He set strict rules for the streets: no robbing Harlem businesses, no violence against women or children, no drugs on the blocks without his say. Anyone who broke the code answered to him. Personally, he became a legend. People said, if you live in Harlem, you live under Bumpy's protection. But peace never lasted long. The police wanted him gone, the Mafia wanted his money, and jealous rivals wanted his power. One night, a small-time hustler named Arthur Pretty Jack tried to challenge Bumpy's authority. He thought the streets were changing, that Bumpy was getting old, losing touch. Pretty Jack set up his own racket, stealing from Bumpy's runners and refusing to pay tribute. It didn't last long. Bumpy found him in a club on 145th Street. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just walked up, looked him in the eye, and said, "In Harlem, there's room for everyone, except fools." Pretty Jack disappeared the next day. No one ever saw him again. The message was clear. Harlem had one king. But Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a businessman and a protector. He used his profits to help Harlem's people. When families couldn't pay rent, he paid it for them. When kids needed school clothes, he bought them. He gave jobs to ex-cons who no one else would hire. To the community, he wasn't a criminal. He was a guardian. He became known as the Black Robin Hood. Even the church preachers who condemned his crimes still nodded when his name came up, because they knew the truth. Without Bumpy, Harlem would have fallen to chaos. But the police didn't care about that. They wanted a headline. They wanted the Harlem gangster behind bars. Detective William O'Reilly, a corrupt cop on the NYPD, made it his mission to bring Bumpy down. He raided gambling spots, harassed business owners, and even tried to bribe Bumpy's men. But every time he got close, Bumpy was already 3 steps ahead. One night, O'Reilly stopped Bumpy on the street and said, "You think you're untouchable, Johnson. One day I'll have you." Bumpy smiled and said, "Maybe. But until then, this is my city." Through the late 1930s and 1940s, Bumpy's influence stretched beyond Harlem. He made alliances with Italian bosses, especially Frank Costello, who respected Bumpy's intelligence and business sense. Together, they built a quiet partnership, Harlem's numbers in exchange for mutual protection. For a time, it worked. Harlem was booming. Jazz filled the air. Money flowed. And for once, peace seemed possible, but Bumpy knew better. He knew the streets never stayed quiet for long. Behind the laughter and music, new threats were rising. younger, wilder men who didn't follow the old rules. They didn't respect the code of honor that Bumpy lived by. They wanted quick money, fast fame, and no discipline, and that, he knew, would be the beginning of Harlem's downfall. One evening, Bumpy stood outside the Teresa Hotel, looking over the lights of the city. He had everything a man could want: money, power, respect. Yet his eyes looked tired. He once said to a friend, "I gave my life to protect Harlem. But sometimes, I wonder if Harlem ever really wanted saving." It was a rare moment of honesty, the kind of thought only a man who carried too much weight could have. Because deep down, Bumpy knew power never comes without pain, and every empire eventually faces its reckoning. The war for the streets had made him a king. But the next battles would test not just his strength, but his soul. By the early 1940s, Bumpy Johnson had become more than just a name whispered in Harlem's alleys. He was a legend, a man who carried himself with class, spoke with wisdom, and ruled with discipline. He wasn't like the other gangsters of his time. He didn't brag, he didn't drink much, and he never lost control. People called him the gentleman gangster. When Bumpy walked into a room, everything went quiet. He wore fine suits, sharp gray or black, tailored to perfection. He carried himself like a businessman, not a thug. And when he spoke, even his enemies listened. He was polite but firm. He treated waiters with respect and gangsters with caution. He quoted books during conversations: Socrates, Plato, and Shakespeare. He once told a young hustler, "A man with a gun can control a street for a day, but a man with a mind can control a city for life." That was Bumpy's philosophy. Brains before bullets. He spent hours in his study reading. His shelves were filled with novels and philosophy. He believed knowledge was power, and that understanding people was the key to ruling them. Even in his world of crime, he had principles. He believed in fairness. He believed in loyalty. And above all, he believed Harlem belonged to its people. If an Italian mobster disrespected a black man, Bumpy handled it personally. If the police abused a local woman, Bumpy found the officer's name and made sure he thought twice next time. To the community, he was a hero with a dark crown, the man who did bad things, but for what he saw as good reasons. Despite his reputation, Bumpy tried to live like a family man. He fell in love with a woman named Mamie Hatcher, a beautiful and intelligent young woman who worked as a waitress at a Harlem nightclub. One evening, Bumpy walked in, calm and confident as always. He asked her to dance. She said no twice. He smiled, tipped his hat, and said, "Then I'll come back until you say yes." And he did. Day after day, until finally she gave him that dance. They soon became inseparable. Mamie saw beyond the gangster. She saw the man, the thinker, the protector, the lover who brought her flowers and quoted poetry. Bumpy treated her with respect, something rare for men in his world. He never raised his voice, and he made sure she lived in comfort and safety. For all his power and violence outside, at home he was calm, gentle, and deeply loyal. But peace for Bumpy Johnson never lasted. The police continued to watch him. The FBI labeled him a dangerous criminal leader. They followed his every move, waiting for one mistake. Still, Bumpy walked Harlem's streets without fear. People nodded when he passed, children smiled, and shopkeepers greeted him with gratitude. He was more than a boss. He was a symbol of pride in a world that offered little of it. Yet deep inside, he carried a storm. He knew that one day the law would catch up to him. And when it did, it wouldn't be because of guns or violence. It would be because of power. In 1951, that storm came. The police raided his home, claiming to find narcotics hidden in the walls. Bumpy swore the drugs were planted, but the courts didn't care. He was sentenced to 10 years in Alcatraz, the most feared prison in America. As the guards led him away, Mamie stood by his side, holding his hand tightly. He looked at her and whispered, "Don't cry, baby. Kings go where they're needed." Then he smiled, calm, proud, unbroken. Alcatraz was known as the Rock, a place built to crush men's spirits. But Bumpy Johnson was no ordinary man. He kept his dignity, even behind bars. He read more than ever, studied history, wrote letters to Mamie, and even helped settle disputes among inmates. The guards called him Mr. Johnson, not out of fear, but out of respect. He never begged, never broke, never lost the code that made him who he was. He once told a fellow prisoner, "A cage don't make you small. Giving up does." Back in Harlem, people spoke of him like a legend gone away to war. Some said he'd return stronger. Others said he'd never come back. But Harlem missed him. The order, the respect, the balance he brought. Without Bumpy, the streets began to fall apart. Younger, reckless hustlers took over. The code of honor was fading. The city was changing, but even from inside Alcatraz, Bumpy's influence lived on. He sent messages, advice, warnings, always guiding his people from the shadows. It was said that even behind bars he ran Harlem. As years passed, Bumpy's legend grew. The newspapers called him the last gentleman. Gangster. The police called him a dangerous mind. But Harlem called him something else entirely, their protector. He was proof that power didn't always wear a badge or come from a boardroom. Sometimes it wore a fine suit, spoke softly, and ruled with a quiet smile. He had lost his freedom, but he hadn't lost himself. And soon, when those prison gates opened again, the world would find that Bumpy Johnson had only gotten smarter. His war wasn't over. It was just waiting for his return. The year was 1952. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, was no longer walking the busy streets he once ruled. He was now a prisoner of Alcatraz, the most feared prison in America, a fortress built on rock, surrounded by freezing waters and razor wire. It was a place designed to break men, to remind them that the world had moved on without them. But for Bumpy, Alcatraz wasn't a cage. It was a classroom, a battlefield of the mind. When Bumpy first arrived, the guards whispered his name like he was royalty. Johnson, one said, that's the Harlem boss. Some called him the gentleman gangster. Others just called him Mr. Johnson. From the start, he refused to bow. He didn't shout, didn't fight, didn't play the fool. He walked with his usual calm, hat low, eyes sharp, every step steady. The guards expected him to act like a criminal. Instead, he acted like a man of discipline. He made his bed perfectly each morning. He kept his cell spotless. He greeted the guards politely and read every book he could get his hands on. Bumpy treated Alcatraz like a test. He studied people, the way they talked, the way they broke. He knew that real strength didn't come from violence. It came from control. He once told another inmate, "They can lock up your body, but not your mind. The moment you lose your mind, you've already lost your freedom." Those words spread through the prison like quiet fire. Men who had given up started standing taller. Even the guards noticed that when Bumpy spoke, others listened. Inside those cold walls, Bumpy became a kind of teacher. He helped inmates read and write. He showed them how to negotiate instead of fight. And for the first time, even in a place built to destroy him, he found peace and order. Every day he'd read philosophy and law. He wanted to understand the system that kept men like him in cages. He read Sun Tzu's The Art of War until the pages turned soft. He underlined one line over and over. The greatest victory is the one that requires no battle. That became his rule, his new weapon. But even from Alcatraz, Bumpy's empire in Harlem still moved. Letters came and went, written in code. Short notes that looked harmless but carried orders, warnings, and messages of loyalty. The guards never caught on. They thought Bumpy was just writing poetry to his wife, Mamie Hatcher, but Mamie knew the truth. She was the bridge between the man in the cell and the streets he built. While others forgot their power behind bars, Bumpy kept his crown. On Sunday mornings, he'd stand by his cell window, staring out at the fog rolling over the water. Most men looked out and saw hopelessness. Bumpy saw patience. He was waiting, sharpening his mind like a blade. He wrote in a letter to Mamie, "They think they've buried me, but I'm still growing roots. When I walk out, I'll be stronger than I ever was." And he meant it. Even the guards respected him. If a fight broke out, they'd look to Bumpy to calm it down. He had no title, no power, no weapons, just presence. Men who had killed without blinking would listen when he spoke softly. One guard once said, "That man could run this place better than the warden." And in a way, he did. He built quiet alliances, and with Italians, Irish, blacks, anyone who had reason to survive. He understood people, and that understanding was his true strength. Years passed. Outside, Harlem changed. New hustlers took over. Drugs flooded the streets. The world was becoming louder, faster, and far more dangerous. But even from his island cell, Bumpy remained a ghost over Harlem, a name that kept order. His lieutenants still used his rules. His allies still sent money to families he'd promised to protect. The legend of Bumpy Johnson refused to fade. Then, after nearly 10 years, the day came. A guard opened his cell and said, "Johnson, you're going home." Bumpy stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just nodded and said, "I was never gone." He packed the few things he had, his books, his letters, his dignity. When he stepped outside, the cold wind hit his face like a reminder of freedom. The ferry ride back was silent. Every wave against the hull felt like time paying him back. When he reached the mainland, reporters were waiting. Flashbulbs popped. "Bumpy, what are your plans now?" they shouted. He adjusted his hat, looked at the cameras, and said quietly, "I'm going home to Harlem." That was all. No threats, no promises, just truth. But the Harlem he returned to was not the Harlem he'd left. The jazz clubs were fading. The old faces were gone. Drugs had taken over, poisoning the streets he once protected. The young men didn't know the old code. They didn't know loyalty. They didn't even know his name. Yet as Bumpy walked through the streets, a few elders nodded with respect. "Welcome home, Mr. Johnson," they said. He smiled slightly. It was good to be back, even if he knew the war wasn't over, because this time, it wouldn't be fought with bullets or fists. It would be fought with wisdom. Bumpy Johnson had survived Alcatraz, not by escaping its walls, but by mastering its silence. He had entered prison as a gangster. He came out as a strategist, a man whose power came not from fear but from thought. And now, he was ready to reclaim the city that had always been his, even if it no longer remembered who its true king was. After 10 long years in Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson came home. But the Harlem that welcomed him back was not the Harlem he had left behind. The bright lights were dimmer now. The music was louder but emptier. The laughter on the streets had turned into shouting, and the rhythm of jazz was slowly being replaced by the noise of sirens. The neighborhood had changed, and so had the world. Bumpy stepped out of a black Cadillac one cold morning in 1963. He stood on Lenox Avenue, looking around at the place he once ruled. The air smelled the same, fried food, car exhaust, and cigarettes. But the faces were different. New hustlers, new gangs, new chaos. He was 60 years old now, but his presence still commanded attention. People turned their heads when he walked by. Older folks whispered his name with respect. The younger ones only saw a well-dressed old man, a legend from a time they didn't understand. Harlem, once the crown jewel of Black America, had become a battlefield. Drugs, especially heroin, had flooded the streets. Addiction was eating away at the community Bumpy had spent his life protecting. Every corner that once had jazz clubs now had dealers. Every block that once danced to music now echoed with pain. The rules were gone. The codes of respect, loyalty, and honor that Bumpy had built, forgotten. The new generation didn't care about boundaries or balance. They cared only about quick money. It hurt him to see it. Harlem had been his home, his pride, his empire. Now it was falling apart. Bumpy sat in his apartment that night, staring out at the city through the window. Mamie was beside him, quiet and graceful as always. She had waited all those years, faithfully, lovingly. Now she watched him trying to fit into a world that had moved on without him. She said softly, "You can't fix everything, Bump. Not anymore." He looked at her and smiled sadly. "Maybe not, but I can try." Bumpy still had influence. People who owed him favors, who remembered his protection, who respected his code. But the police saw him as a threat again, a ghost from the past. They followed him everywhere, waiting for a reason to strike. And yet, when Bumpy walked into a room, the air still changed. Even the new gangsters felt it, that mix of fear and admiration. He didn't need guns or muscle. He had presence. He told one young hustler, "You think power comes from the barrel of a gun. It don't. Power comes from how people see you when you ain't even there." But Bumpy wasn't fighting just street wars anymore. A new battle was rising, the civil rights movement. All across America, black people were marching for freedom, equality, and justice. Leaders like Malcolm X were calling for change, and Harlem became a center of protest and pride. Bumpy respected Malcolm. They met several times. Two different men with one shared mission, to uplift Harlem's people. Malcolm spoke of unity and truth. Bumpy spoke of protection and survival. One evening, they sat together in a quiet diner. Malcolm said, "Brother Johnson, our people don't need guns." "They need education," Bumpy replied calmly. "Education won't stop a bullet, Malcolm. I've seen both sides. Sometimes you need both the book and the man holding the street." They didn't always agree, but there was mutual respect. Malcolm saw in Bumpy a man who had fought his own kind of war, and Bumpy saw in Malcolm a hope he wished the world could keep. Still, the streets didn't forgive or forget. Young dealers, reckless and hungry, started testing Bumpy's patience. They didn't follow the old rules. They sold drugs near schools, stole from their own, and crossed lines no one used to dare. Bumpy called a meeting one night with the young leaders of Harlem's new crews. He told them, "You boys got no discipline. You think the streets are yours? But they ain't. Harlem belongs to the people, not the poison you're selling." Some listened. Most didn't. The old ways were dying, and even Bumpy Johnson couldn't stop time. But he tried. He still helped struggling families, paid hospital bills, and protected the elderly. He never forgot the people who had built Harlem from nothing, and though he was no saint, many still said Harlem slept safer when Bumpy was around. He was a bridge between two worlds, the old Harlem of dignity and the new Harlem of desperation. And that bridge was cracking. One night, Mamie found him sitting alone at the kitchen table, lost in thought. He looked tired, older than his years. She poured him coffee and said, "What's wrong, Bump?" He smiled faintly and said, "I spent my life trying to control Harlem." But maybe Harlem was never meant to be controlled. There was no anger in his voice, just truth. He had given everything to a city that no longer played by his rules. Still, he wasn't done. Bumpy Johnson didn't quit. He adapted. He began forming quiet alliances again, not with gangsters this time, but with community leaders, activists, and business owners. He helped organize charity drives. He funded scholarships. He even worked behind the scenes to keep peace between rival groups. Harlem didn't know it, but its old guardian had returned, not to rule, but to protect what little good was left. Bumpy Johnson was older now, wiser, slower, but still dangerous in the right way. He had survived the South, the Mafia, and Alcatraz. He had seen friends die and legends fade, but through it all, he remained the same man, a man who never let the world tell him who he was. The times were changing. The streets were changing. But the code he lived by, respect, loyalty, and pride, that would never change. It was the summer of 1968. America was changing faster than ever. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated just months before. Riots burned through cities, and in Harlem the streets were tense, filled with anger, grief, and confusion. Amid all the chaos, one man still walked the same blocks, calm and collected, his presence like a piece of the old world refusing to fade away. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was 62 now. His hair had turned silver, his walk slower, but his mind was still sharp as a blade. To Harlem, he was a living legend, a reminder of the days when power meant respect and rules still mattered. That night, July 7, 1968, Harlem was restless. People argued on street corners about politics, race, and change. The air was hot and heavy, summer heat mixed with frustration, but Bumpy wasn't thinking about the future anymore. He was thinking about peace, about the life he had lived, the wars he had fought, the people he had helped, the mistakes he couldn't erase. He told Mamie earlier that evening, "I just want a quiet night. No meetings, no business, just me, my city, and a good meal." She smiled and said, "Then go do that, baby. You've earned it." So he put on his finest gray suit, polished shoes, and a neat hat. Even in old age, Bumpy dressed like a man who respected himself and demanded respect in return. He walked down 7th Avenue toward Wells Restaurant, one of Harlem's most famous spots. It was his favorite place. Simple, warm, filled with familiar faces. The smell of fried chicken and coffee floated through the door as he stepped inside. The crowd greeted him with smiles and nods. "Evening, Mr. Johnson. Good to see you, Bumpy." He nodded back politely as always. No arrogance, no flash, just quiet pride. He took his usual seat near the corner window, ordered fried chicken, grits, and coffee, and leaned back, watching the world outside. For a moment, everything felt right. The music played softly from the jukebox. Laughter echoed from another table. The city he loved, broken as it was, still lived, still breathed. He talked with friends, cracked a few jokes, and even laughed. A deep, calm laugh that came from a man who had seen it all and survived it all. Then, in a single heartbeat, the laughter stopped. Bumpy's hand slipped from his coffee cup. His face tightened, and his body went still. He tried to speak, but no words came. The people at his table jumped up. "Bumpy, you okay?" But he wasn't. Within seconds, the man who had ruled Harlem for 3 decades collapsed silently to the floor. The restaurant went quiet. Diners froze in disbelief. Some thought it was another heart attack scare. He had suffered 1 year before. But this time it was different. This time there was no coming back. Mamie arrived minutes later. When she saw him lying there, she didn't scream. She didn't cry, not at first. She just knelt beside him, holding his hand, whispering his name. "Bumpy, baby." "You rest now." Her tears fell onto his sleeve as the sirens wailed outside. News spread through Harlem like fire. Within hours, the streets were filled with whispers. "Bumpy's gone. Mr. Johnson passed. The king is dead." People stopped what they were doing. Old men in barbershops went silent. Women in beauty parlors crossed themselves. Even the young ones, the ones who barely knew who he was, could feel that something had changed. The heartbeat of Harlem had stopped for a moment. His funeral was held a few days later. Thousands came. Gangsters, preachers, neighbors, and families he had helped through the years. They filled the church and spilled into the streets. Some wore black suits, others came in everyday clothes. But all came with respect. The preacher said he was not a perfect man, but he was a man who never turned his back on Harlem. And when they carried his casket down the aisle, people wept openly. They didn't just lose a man, they lost a protector, a symbol, a piece of Harlem's soul. Outside the church, as the procession moved through the streets, people stood on their stoops waving. Some threw flowers. Some simply whispered, "Goodbye, Bumpy." Mamie walked behind the casket, holding her head high. She didn't weep for the man the world called a gangster. She wept for the husband who had loved her with all his heart. That night, Harlem felt different, quieter, as if the city itself knew one of its giants had fallen. The restaurants, the bars, the sidewalks, all carried his memory. Old men told stories about the time Bumpy saved a shopkeeper from the mob. Women remembered how he helped pay their rent when they had nowhere else to go. Even those who had feared him couldn't deny what he had done, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a man who gave Harlem something it desperately needed: dignity. In the end, he didn't die in a shootout or a prison cell. He died where he belonged, in Harlem, surrounded by his people, at peace with his life. The newspapers called it a heart attack, but to Harlem, it was something bigger. It was the end of an era, the closing of a story that could never truly be repeated. For decades, he had walked the line between right and wrong, good and evil, love and power. And in doing so, he became something larger than life, a symbol of what it meant to fight for respect in a world that offered none. That night, as the lights dimmed across the neighborhood, someone spray-painted a simple message on a brick wall near Lenox Avenue. "Long live Bumpy." And for generations to come, those words would remind Harlem of the man who never asked for forgiveness, but always gave protection. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, it felt like Harlem itself took a deep breath and held it. For decades, his name had been more than a man's. It was a force, a promise, a warning. Now with him gone, the city moved slower. The streets whispered, and in every corner of Harlem, people remembered the man who had protected them, punished their enemies, and given them something rare: respect. In the days after his funeral, stories spread like wildfire. Old men on barbershop corners swapped memories. They spoke about the time Bumpy paid a family's rent after their father was jailed, or how he once bought toys for 100 poor kids one Christmas. To some, he was Harlem's protector. To others, a sinner trying to save his soul. But to everyone, he was unforgettable. The people said, Bumpy wasn't perfect, but when he walked these streets, no one dared to disrespect Harlem. And in a time when black pride was under fire, that meant everything. After his death, Mamie Johnson carried his memory like a torch. She lived quietly but proudly, always reminding people that her husband wasn't just a gangster. He was a man of principle. She later wrote a book, telling the world what the headlines never said, that Bumpy Johnson loved books more than bullets, and that every crime he committed had come with a purpose, to protect Harlem from people who wanted to own it. She once said, Bumpy was no angel, but he had a heart, and it beat for Harlem. Years passed. The 1970s brought more drugs, more violence, and more chaos to Harlem. The kind of order Bumpy once maintained was gone. Younger generations barely knew his name, until the movies found him again. In 1997, Hollywood told his story in the film Hoodlum. Actor Lawrence Fishburne played Bumpy Johnson with power, intelligence, and quiet dignity, reminding the world that behind every gangster story is a man trying to survive. The film showed his war with Dutch Schultz, his loyalty to Madame St. Clair, and his love for Harlem. But more than that, it showed a man who refused to kneel, no matter who stood in front of him. Audiences loved it. Critics called it one of the most human gangster films ever made. And suddenly, Bumpy Johnson's name was alive again, spoken, debated, respected. A decade later, American Gangster, 2007, told another side of the story. This time, Bumpy appeared as a mentor to a younger man, Frank Lucas, who would later become infamous in his own right. In the film, Bumpy was portrayed by Clarence Williams III, an older man walking through Harlem's changing streets, talking about respect, discipline, and the value of community. In one haunting scene, he clutches his chest, the same heart attack that ended his real life, and collapses on the sidewalk. That scene brought tears to many who knew the truth. Because it wasn't just a death, it was history repeating itself on screen. But it was 2020's Godfather of Harlem, starring Forrest Whitaker, that truly brought Bumpy Johnson's story back to life for a new generation. The show didn't just show the gangster, it showed the man. The husband, the thinker, the friend of Malcolm X, the leader who tried to balance crime and community in a world stacked against him. Forrest Whitaker's performance captured Bumpy's complexity, his anger, his love, his intelligence, and his pain. And through the show, millions of viewers around the world finally learned what Harlem had always known. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and rebellion. Today, decades after his death, his story continues to inspire books, songs, and documentaries. Hip-hop artists reference his name in lyrics. Writers compare him to Robin Hood, and historians call him one of the most important figures in African-American organized history. Even those who never met him can feel his shadow in Harlem's story, the balance between survival and pride, between power and purpose. Walk through Harlem today, and you'll still find his name painted on murals and whispered in stories. Some older residents say they can still picture him walking down 125th Street, hat tilted, suit pressed, eyes sharp, moving with that quiet confidence that no one could fake. They say if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the rhythm of jazz and imagine Bumpy sitting in a corner cafe, watching over his city like he always did. Time has turned the man into myth, but the myth never strayed far from truth. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't powerful because of violence. He was powerful because he understood respect. He understood that every man, rich or poor, wanted to be treated with dignity, and he gave Harlem that dignity, even if it meant breaking the rules to do it. In the end, his life was a story of contradictions, crime and compassion, violence and wisdom, fear and love. He lived in a world where power was survival, but he never forgot his people, his neighborhood, his code. Bumpy Johnson's legend didn't end with his death. It began there, because legends never really die. They just become part of the streets that made them. And in Harlem, his spirit still walks. Through every story told, every mural painted, every song written about strength, pride, and defiance. Even after his death, Bumpy Johnson's name refused to fade. It lived in whispers in old photographs and in the rhythm of Harlem itself. He had become more than a man. He was an idea, a symbol of what it meant to stand tall when the world tried to push you down. To understand Bumpy's legacy, you have to understand where he came from. A world that gave him nothing. Yet he built everything, born poor in the South. He rose to power in one of the toughest cities in America. He faced racism, corruption, and betrayal, but he never let anyone define him. That was his true strength. Not his fists, Not his gun, but his will. He lived by a simple code: respect above all. Respect for himself, respect for his people, respect for the streets that raised him. Decades later, that code still echoes through Harlem. You can see it in the faces of old men who sit outside barbershops telling stories. You can hear it in the rhythm of jazz and hip-hop, in the lyrics that speak about loyalty and pride. Rappers, writers, and filmmakers still mention his name, not to glorify crime, but to celebrate resilience, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a man who dared to fight a system designed to keep him small. And in that fight, he gave Harlem, and generations after him, something priceless: dignity. In the 1960s, when others saw Harlem as a place of poverty and crime, Bumpy saw it as a kingdom. He believed that black people could run their own businesses, protect their own neighborhoods, and take pride in who they were, even when the world called him a criminal. His community called him a protector. That duality, hero and outlaw, became part of his legend. It's what made him real. It's what made him human. Modern scholars and historians often debate his story. Some call him a criminal mastermind. Others call him a misunderstood leader. But those who lived through his time knew the truth. Bumpy Johnson was both. He was the bridge between two worlds, the lawless streets and the lawful dreams. He showed that power could exist in a black man's hands, at a time when society said it could not. That's why his story still matters. Because it isn't just about Harlem. It's about freedom. Even decades later, his influence can be seen in culture and community. His story inspired books, films, and series that reshaped how America viewed its gangsters. Unlike others who ruled through chaos, Bumpy ruled through control, calm, intelligence, and compassion. He didn't want to destroy Harlem. He wanted to protect it from outsiders who tried to profit off its pain. He once said, and Mamie repeated it years later, "If Harlem must bow, let it bow to no one but itself." Those words still hang heavy in the air for those who know his story. But Bumpy's legacy isn't just about power. It's about balance. He taught that life in the streets was a test of loyalty, patience, and principle. He wasn't proud of every choice he made, but he believed every choice came with responsibility. He helped people when no one else would. He fed the poor. He kept violence in check. He punished those who harmed the innocent. That's why, even today, some Harlem elders call his time the Golden Years, a time when the streets had rules and when power had purpose. For young people growing up in Harlem now, Bumpy Johnson's story is often told as a lesson about strength, but also about cost, because Bumpy's life teaches one hard truth: power built on respect lasts. Power built on greed destroys. He earned loyalty because he gave it. He commanded fear because he never abused it. He led with heart as much as with strategy. That combination, brains, bravery, and compassion, is what turned a street hustler into a king. In the years after his passing, Harlem changed again. New leaders rose, movements formed. The struggle for equality continued. But through all of it, Bumpy Johnson's name remained a shadow, a reminder of what it meant to hold your ground, to never bow your head, to live and die by your own code. If you walk through Harlem today, you'll find murals of him on old brick walls, his face painted strong, wise, unbroken. Beside them are words that say, "Respect is power," and that's what his story truly was, not about crime, not about violence, but about power earned through respect. He showed that even in a world stacked against you, you could rise, you could lead, and you could stand with pride. To this day, his life inspires artists, dreamers, and fighters, people who refuse to be silent, people who build their own paths, people who believe that greatness isn't given, it's taken, because that's what Bumpy Johnson did. He took his destiny in his own hands and turned the impossible into a legacy. In the story of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson will always be the man who stood between two worlds, the streets and the system, the sinner and the savior, the man and the myth. His life reminds us that power means nothing without purpose, and respect means nothing without love. And though time moves on, his legacy still whispers through the city he built, a reminder that true strength isn't found in fear, but in pride. Time moves on, but some names refuse to fade. Some stories never end. In every heartbeat of Harlem, in every rhythm that rises from its streets, there is still a whisper, a name carried through generations. Bumpy Johnson. It has been decades since the man they called the Godfather of Harlem took his final breath. But his shadow still stretches across the city, not as fear, not as crime, but as memory. A memory of strength, of pride, of a man who lived by his own code when the world gave him none. Walk through 125th Street today, and you'll see a Harlem reborn, different from the one Bumpy ruled, but still pulsing with the same fire he once protected. Jazz clubs have turned into art galleries. Street corners now host poets instead of hustlers. Children play where gunfire once echoed. And yet, behind it all, there's still that old Harlem soul, tough, proud, and unbroken. The same spirit Bumpy Johnson carried through every fight of his life. For many, he remains a legend wrapped in contradictions, part hero, part outlaw, a man both feared and loved. But that's the truth of Harlem itself, a place built on struggle and beauty, on pain and pride. Bumpy's life was a reflection of that balance. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't pure, but he was real, and that's why people still speak his name with respect. In classrooms and documentaries, historians call him a symbol of resistance. He defied not just the Mafia or the police, but a system that said black men could not lead, could not rule, could not dream. Bumpy proved them wrong. He led not with speeches, but with action. Not with politics, but with power, earned, fought for, and held with pride. He became Harlem's protector in an age when few others dared to stand up. And in doing so, he became part of something greater, the spirit of Harlem itself. His story has traveled far beyond New York. It's been told on big screens, in music, in art, and whispered in homes where families teach their children about strength and self-respect. To some, he's a cautionary tale, a man consumed by his own power. To others, he's a hero, a fighter who gave his life to protect his people. To Harlem, he's both, a symbol of what it means to rise from nothing and still keep your soul. In one of her final interviews, Mamie Johnson said softly, "People remember him for being a gangster. I remember him for being a man who read poetry before bed, who brought me roses even after the hardest days, and who never stopped loving his people." Her words cut through the myths. Behind the legend was a husband, a thinker, a man who wanted peace but lived in war. That was the paradox of Bumpy Johnson, the mind of a philosopher in the body of a street general. His influence still breathes through Harlem's new generation. When community leaders speak of unity, when artists talk about power and pride, when young men lift their heads high despite the odds, that's Bumpy's spirit alive again. He taught Harlem that power without purpose is empty, and that real leadership comes from protecting, not exploiting. He showed that you could be both strong and kind, feared and loved, flawed yet unforgettable. Even now, tourists visit the places where he once stood, Lenox Avenue, Wells Restaurant, the old blocks of Sugar Hill. They ask the locals, "Did Bumpy really walk here?" And the locals smile. Walk here? He ruled here. But then they add quietly, he ruled with his mind. Because long before the movies, long before the headlines, Bumpy Johnson's true gift wasn't violence, it was vision. He saw Harlem not as a battlefield, but as a home worth defending. And even when the world called him a criminal, Harlem called him something else, their own. In a city that's always changing, legends like Bumpy remind people where they came from. They remind Harlem that strength is not just about survival, but about dignity. He was a man who demanded respect when the world refused to give it. And in doing so, he gave his people something even greater, the belief that they were worthy of it. So when you walk through those streets and feel that rhythm in the air, the mix of music, hope, and history, remember the man who helped shape it, the man who wore a fine suit, who read poetry by night and ruled by day, the man who stood between the powerful and the powerless and said, "Not in my city." His story began in the struggle of the South, rose in the heart of Harlem, and ended with a legacy that refuses to die. Because Bumpy Johnson was more than a gangster. He was a guardian, a leader, a legend. And in every note of Harlem's music, in every proud face that walks its streets, his spirit still moves, unseen, unbroken, immortal. He ruled Harlem with respect. He left it with pride.